My name is Lee Moore, and this is again another Robless episode of the Chinese Literature Podcast. Before I get started, I have two housekeeping items. First, I wanted to reach out to you, the listener. If there is anyone there amongst our listeners who is in the publishing industry and you feel comfortable, I was wondering if you would be willing to shoot me an email at ChineseLiteraturePodcast@gmail.com. Previously on the podcast, I've mentioned a book project that I'm working on. It's related to the podcast, using the podcast as a platform to talk about the literature and history of China. Right now, I'm in the stage of looking for an agent. I'm almost done with my book proposal and sample chapter. So I was wondering if any of our listeners had any experience in the publishing industry. If you do and you're willing to connect, send me an email at ChineseLiteraturePodcast@gmail.com. If you know someone who's a literary agent, or even if you're just willing to read over a draft of the book proposal or the sample chapter, I'd really appreciate it if you reached out to me. Next, as you can probably hear, I have a bit of a cold, so today I may sound a little bit nasally. I apologize about that. And the final bit of housekeeping on the agenda before we jump into the main podcast. The last time we talked, that was 2 weeks ago, I said that this week I was going to be doing a poem by Mao Zedong that's kind of related to last episode's Wang Anshi poem. I had that podcast set up, it's recorded, it's ready to go, but then the news happened. So I made the decision to delay the Mao podcast until the next episode, so that will be coming in 2 weeks. This week, we have to talk about a poem that appeared just on Thursday. So this is airing on Saturday, just on Thursday, on the side of a bridge in Beijing. Well, I say poem. I'm calling it a poem. Most of the media reports on this poem are not calling it a poem, but it is a poem. So a little bit of context, and then I'll read my translation of that poem. On Thursday morning, that is 2 days ago, in Beijing, at the Sitong Bridge, which is close to Renmin Dashui, the People's University, just down the road from the Big Bell Temple on the Third Ring Road, someone stopped on top of that bridge, a very busy intersection, and hung two banners off the side of the bridge. One of the banners said, "Go on strike from school, go on strike from work, dismiss from office the dictatorial traitor to the country, Xi Jinping." Wow. You don't see that very often in China today. So I just want to say again, wow. Increasingly, there is a limited amount of space for dissent in China. So to have someone in such a public venue say that is quite striking. Now, the second banner that this person unveiled is a short 6-line, 3-couplet poem. And I'm going to post the original Chinese along with my translation on the website, ChineseLiteraturePodcast.com. Here, I'm just going to read out my translation of the poem and not the original. We don't want nucleic acid test. We want to eat. We don't want the Cultural Revolution. We want reform. We don't want lockdowns. We want freedom. We don't want a leader. We want voting. We don't want lies. We want respect. We don't want to be slaves. We want to be citizens. So first, this is a pretty brave move by this poet. This is clearly a cry for help from someone in China who's tired of the zero COVID policy. And based off of what I've seen, this poet is probably not alone in their thinking, though they are the only person who's so eloquently put it up in such a public form. Second, I want to talk about the poetical nature of this literary work. So this is a poem drawing off of some pretty classical conventions of Chinese poetry. Now, it's not fitting into any one particular genre of Chinese poetry, but you do have a lot of elements of the sort of classical form. So it's a 6-line poem with 7 characters per line. That's similar to a kind of poem called a jueju. Now, it is not a jueju. Jueju, I believe, are always 4 lines, so they're always going to be what we would in English call a quatrain. But if you look closely at this poem in Chinese, there are actually a lot of elements pretty typical of a Chinese poem, as with most 7-character poems in Chinese. Each line is further subdivided into a part with 4 characters in the beginning and a part with 3 characters at the end. What happens in the first 4 characters is in some way resolved in the last 3 characters. So let's just break down that first line. The first four characters say, we don't want nucleic acid tests. The last three characters answer, we want to eat. So the latter half of the line is responding to the first half of the line. In China today, there's a policy of being forced to take nucleic acid test. The poet's saying, let's get rid of that, down with the nucleic acid test. And simultaneously, because of lockdowns, lots of folks in China have complained of starving. There is this kind of juxtaposition of get rid of the zero COVID policies. Let's focus on just allowing people to eat. Just a brief note here. The word 吃饭, to eat food, it can also mean to make a living. It's kind of analogous to, in English, we say, put bread on the table, where food becomes a metonymy for livelihood. I think you could actually interpret this phrase, 吃饭, to mean either literally to eat food, or it could also mean to make a living, to provide for your own livelihood. Both of those interpretations are plausible, but I translated it as to eat because there has been a very loud discussion after the lockdowns in Shanghai and the lockdowns in Xinjiang about so many people going without food. Translating it as to eat just seems right to me. I can't read the poet's mind, but since both are acceptable, I think that to eat just makes a little bit more sense. Okay, back to the poetical form. So this back and forth between the first four characters of a line and the latter three characters of a line happens in each of the 6 lines. In line 3, you have the first half, we don't want lockdowns. The second half is contrasting with that. We want freedom. Line 4, we don't want a leader. The second half, we do want voting. So I need to talk a little bit about the word leader here in Chinese. So the word that this poem actually uses is 领袖. There are other words that mean leader in Chinese. Probably the most common is 领导. But the word used here, 领袖, has an interesting history, and it's not an accident that the poet chose this word. The word 领袖 is closely associated with Mao, and particularly with Mao's most tyrannical policies. Mao was frequently called 伟大领袖, that is just great leader, or 人民领袖, the people's leader. After Mao died, his successor, Hua Guofeng, adopted the title 人民领袖. But at the time, most people were actually tired of Mao's nonsense and tyranny. Very quickly, Hua Guofeng gets pushed out of power very quietly. Most people who aren't, scholars of China don't even know Hua Guofeng existed in between Mao and Deng Xiaoping. Deng Xiaoping takes over. Hua Guofeng loses the title of 人民领袖 in 1981, I think. And Deng Xiaoping actually refused to accept the title 领袖. He wanted people just to call him Comrade Deng, 统治. So Deng Xiaoping is making this conscious effort to try and use a term that suggests equality. He's walking away from the Maoist notion of a cult of personality, and he's trying to adopt a term that connotes eye-to-eye level discussions. Obviously, Deng Xiaoping was the national leader, but at the very least, he's using terms that move away from the sense of superiority. Now, after Deng, no leader in China dared to use the term 领袖, that is, until Xi Jinping. In 2017, as he was paving the way to getting rid of term limits within the Constitution for his position, some of the political organs within the CCP began calling Xi 领袖. In other words, they were trying to revive this term associated with Mao's cult of personality and use it for Xi Jinping. So this poet's use of the term 领袖 here is not an accident. He's positioning 领袖as against democracy. He's just juxtaposing 领袖and this cult of personality of Mao, which Xi Jinping is attempting to develop, and he's juxtaposing that with this hope for democracy. As we start to wrap this up, I want to point out a couple more things. In each line, I translated the subject as we. The Chinese is actually without a subject in the original, as is often the case in Chinese writing, particularly in Chinese poems. The subject is just left off. The reader has to guess what the subject is. Is it we? Is it I? Is it you? It's not clear. But here, considering how public this display of the poem is, I would suggest that it feels like the poet is arguing that there's this broad we that they are trying to represent. Another thing, I think it's interesting that the poet is evoking the Cultural Revolution. There is the sense that all forms of tyranny in the PRC emerge out of Mao and the Cultural Revolution. Of course, that's not true. You could point out other leaders who were tyrannical in the history of the PRC. Deng Xiaoping and Li Peng have both at times been called the Butcher of Beijing, but this poet is evoking the deepest depths of Mao's craziness, that is, the Cultural Revolution. He's using it as a signifier of the way that today things in China are going to hell in a handbasket, and they're moving back towards Mao. Okay, I think that's enough trying to digest this very newsworthy and very interesting poem. I'm going to let y'all go and drink some tea and honey to help resolve this thing with my voice that you have suffered through for so long. Just a reminder, 2 weeks from now, I will air that episode of Mao's poem related to the Wang Anshe poem that I talked about in the previous episode. Then, after that, Rob is going to be back, I promise. This week, I'm going to leave you with a phrase that I recently learned. It's about the tradition in China of risking one's life to do the right thing, even if it gets you killed. The phrase is 识得一身剐，敢把皇帝拉下马. That is, at risk of death, dare to throw the emperor from his horse. In other words, if you know what you're doing is righteous, even if the government is going to kill you as you violate the emperor, you should still do that right thing. This is Lee Moore signing off. Until next time, this is the Chinese Literature Podcast.